The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dan Jeline with the Highway Safety Research Center, and I'm glad to welcome you to the webinar today. Glad you're able to join us. We're excited you could join us for this discussion about innovation, experimentation, and the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD. Today's session is going to explore opportunities to test and evaluate new designs and treatments that can improve safety and comfort for pedestrians and bicyclists. Our panelists will share some information about the MUTCD experimentation process and share some findings from recent experiments and give you some more guidance you can use to really think about how you can experiment and try new innovative things within the appropriate channels. And so we're glad you're here to participate in that discussion. This webinar is supported by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety through a program that provides training and technical assistance to the FHWA designated pedestrian and bicyclist focus cities and states. I'd like to introduce you now to each of the panelists that will be joining us today. First, we're joined by Bill DeSantis. Bill is the Corporate Director of Bicycle Transportation Planning and Design at VHB and has overall technical responsibility for non-motorized and safety improvement projects ranging from local on-road bicycle networks to regional bicycle and pedestrian trails. Bill is the chair of the Bicycle Technical Committee of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. He's also a member of the League of American Bicyclists, a league cycling instructor, and a bicycle commuter. So we're very happy to have Bill joining us today. Bill is joined by Dave Kirshner. Dave is the transportation specialist on the MUTCD team at the Federal Highway Administration, responsible for pavement markings and bicycle facilities. Dave has 12 years of experience in transportation planning, engineering, and project management in both the public and private sectors. He's been with the Federal Highway Administration for 2 years with a focus on developing and promoting safe, clear, and effective traffic control devices for all road users. So Bill and Dave together have just a wealth of knowledge and experience on this topic that we're going to be covering today. We're really lucky to have them joining us and look forward to their presentations and discussion. Before we get into all that, I just wanted to shift gears for a moment and talk through a few housekeeping items. Attendees, I'd like to ask you if you can hear me, and if you can see my screen and all that, if you can raise your hand. Your hand icon is located in the upper left-hand corner of your control panel. If I see those hands going up, that'll let me know that I'm coming through loud and clear, and I do see them going up. Great. I'm glad that you can hear me and glad that you're here today. I want to let you know that if your computer freezes at all during the session today, I'd encourage you to reload the website and log back in. You should be able to just rejoin the session there. Note that you won't have the ability to speak during the webinar as an attendee, but you will have the ability to send us questions and comments using the chat function. You can ask those questions, send those comments in at any time. We'll be monitoring that area. We will be holding about half an hour at the end of the presentations for a discussion session with our presenters. We will be posting, actually I already have posted the presentation slides from today's webinar at our website, pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I dropped the link into the chat pod. I'll send it out again in just a moment so you can follow along with us. We are also recording the webinar today, and we'll be posting that to our archive page, hopefully by tomorrow, so you can look back at anything you might miss. Later today, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center that'll contain a link to allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for this webinar. So if you're attending with multiple people at your site, you want to just make sure that you share that link with them, forward that email along so that they can also generate that certificate. The email is going to have a few other things in it as well. It's going to have a link to our archive page for this webinar. It's going to have some information about how to sign up for our newsletter in case you want to learn about new webinars that we have going on. So take a look at that. That, again, should be coming in about an hour after the webinar ends today. You can check our websites and follow us on social media if you would like to learn more about our webinars or sign up for upcoming sessions. We have a newsletter that we distribute quarterly if you'd like to sign up for that to receive our updates. We do have one webinar that's going to be coming up in about a month. We haven't sent the full announcement out for this one yet, but you all can get a sneak peek and register for it if you like. It's going to be all about making signals work for bicyclists and pedestrians. Peter Kuntz will be leading this session for us. It's on October 18th, about a month from now. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics related to signals, including signal timing, cycle length, signal phasing, speed management using signal timing strategies, things like that. So if that's an area of interest for you, or if you'd like to learn a little more about what you can do with traffic signals, I'd encourage you to sign up for that webinar. Again, it's in about a month, and you can find the registration information at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I'll pass around the registration link in the chat pod in just a moment. One thing I'd like to do before we get into our presentations today is just take a quick poll of the audience. We're interested in finding out a little more about how many people are out there today. So if you could take a moment and look at the poll on your screen. We're really interested to find out, is it just you attending? Do you have a small group with you? Are you joining us with a larger group? We're just trying to find out more about how people are attending our webinars and accessing this information. So I'll leave that poll open for maybe another 10 or 15 seconds while you vote, and then we'll continue right along with today's presentation. Okay, great. Just a few more seconds on the poll, and then we'll close it down. Continue on with our presentation. Okay, perfect. Thank you all so much for participating in that poll. We aren't going to delay too much more, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to our first panelist, Bill DeSantis. So Bill, keep an eye on your screen. You should see the control come across, and you can take control and go live with your slides.
Okay. Sorry, my presentation just went down.
No problem, Bill. Take time. All right.
Okay. So just a little bit of discussion about the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. We assist Federal Highway in developing content for the manual. We were formed in 1931 and have gone through publishing the MUTCD from 1931 until 1971. After 1971, the ownership of the manual was sent to Federal Highway. So since then, the National Committee has been in an advisory role to Federal Highway. One takeaway from this webinar I'd like you to have is to know that the final decision on the actual content of the manual and the schedule for the update rests with the federal government, not with the National Committee. There are a lot of claims and whatnot out there on social media that perhaps the National Committee and the Bike Committee are resistant to change. That is just not true. And the reality is it's a great collaboration between the members of the committee, including state agency people, local municipal officials, people from the private sector like myself, working with the Federal Highway team, which David is a member, to develop the content and changes to the manual. If you go to our website, you can see under the Bicycle Committee list a listing of the proposals we've developed and some of the changes that we're working on. The webinar next month that Dan just mentioned with Peter, Peter's a member of the committee, so those are the kinds of things that we're working with Federal Highway on. The focus of our mission is to develop standards, guidelines, and practices for traffic control devices. We develop proposals as recommendations for revisions to the manual. We also provide a forum for professionals with very diverse backgrounds, both technically and regionally, to exchange information that helps us put these proposals together. And I would note that we're a volunteer organization. We all pay our own way to the meetings and whatnot. And membership is open to interested professionals, and there's information on our website to explain the process for joining. What is the National Committee? It's basically two parts. There's a council of 37 voting members representing 21 sponsoring organizations. Those organizations include AASHTO, ITE, National Association of County Engineers, those types of organizations. But it also includes the League of American Bicyclists and the Association of Pedestrian Bicycle Professionals. The second part is the technical committees, which do the actual work of developing the proposals. There are 8 technical committees: regulatory warning, guide and motorist information signs, markings, signals, temporary traffic controls for work zones, the railroad and light rail grade crossings, bicycles, and then research. There is one other committee called the Edit Committee, which oversees the general content and the content in Part 1 of the manual. The process is basically a consensus building process where we utilize research and information from experiments to improve existing devices or recommend new ones. The technical committees review that research and information. We develop a draft proposal. In terms of the bike committee, because much of our information overlaps with some of the other committees, we coordinate with them. We then send those proposals out to sponsoring organizations and get back comments. We then may revise the proposal based on those comments. We present it to the voting members of the council, and if it is approved by a vote of 2/3 of the members, it's sent to Federal Highway as a formal recommendation for changes to the MUTCD. And again, membership in the National Committee is open to interested professionals. Why do we have a national standard for traffic control devices? That picture I got off of eBay for doing a search for antique stop signs. So I think the key is in the title. Uniformity is very important for the design and placement of control devices, as that would be critical of the safe operation for all roadway users, motorized and non-motorized. It's also important that the traffic control devices standards and guidelines be developed consistent with traffic codes and rules of the road. One thing that is troubling to us is that the United States Uniform Vehicle Code has not been updated since 2001. So if you think of all the, for instance, bike-related devices that have been coming online, there is no Uniform Vehicle Code keeping up with those changes. So it is a bit troubling. Most states adopted the national manual as their state standard. Some states have a supplement that is slightly different, but that does require approval by Federal Highway. Most states also have laws or regulations stating that municipalities can install devices on roadways under their control without the approval of DOT, provided they follow the state standard. So again, conformance with the MUTCD is very important in managing your public roads and bikeways. But the issue is, what happens if you need a new device that's not in the manual, or you have an application for an existing device that's not covered? Well, there is a process, and that's called the experimentation process. The goal on that is to seek an effective traffic control device. The purpose of the experimentation is to allow practitioners to test new devices or new applications of existing devices to see if they perform more effectively than what is currently in the manual, or if there, again, is not a manual, something in the manual that addresses that particular situation. So again, the key is trying out a new device or new application of an existing device. The requirements to get an experimental approval are contained in section 1A.10 of the MUTCD, specifically paragraphs 8 to 11. the request must come from a state DOT or a local municipality or agency. Basically, the owner of the roadway must be the one requesting the experiment. The request must include a research plan describing what data will be collected, how it will be collected, and how it will be analyzed. Again, the key for the experimental plan is to produce data for an objective review of the results. Experimentation can only begin after a written approval from the Federal Highway Administration. It's very important that folks do apply and go through the experiment process, because again, that information is used by both the National Committee and Federal Highway when we consider changes to the manual. There are right now a number of experiments out there based, here's a listing by application to what part of the manual. You can see that the bicycle facilities requests far outnumber the other requests for other parts. I think that is due in large part to the new and emerging bike designs that are rapidly appearing on scene. And as David will show you, a lot of the more recent interim approvals are for bike-related devices. Again, another reason why municipalities and agencies should apply for an experimental approval is because if you're using a device that's not in there, or an application that's not in the manual, or that violates the standards requirements of the manual, or that is not covered by an interim approval without first obtaining the experimental approval, you face risk of potential legal liability if a crash should occur. And I mean, the common sense question is, why wouldn't you actively monitor an experimental treatment to make sure it's working as anticipated? And you could also face loss of federal funding for certain projects. It's also, again, very important that we get this information so we can do an objective scientific evaluation of new devices or new applications. And I think I don't want to speak for Federal Highway, but I think the number of requests that come in for a particular device may have some impact on the urgency to issue an interim approval, and certainly has an impact on our work in the National Committee in realizing that a particular subject or device or application should be addressed. A lot of folks think that the experiment process is very complicated. It is not. Federal Highway has a status web page, which will give you the address at the end of the presentation, but it does give you some very useful information on submitting a request for specific treatments, including the background of why the proposed treatment should be used and what is the intended purpose, suggested roadway characteristics or locations where that experimental device might be applicable. It provides the minimum design elements that you should include in your experiment, including those that are required, the elements that are recommended, and then elements that Federal Highway considers to be optional. And there's also a list of current and similar experiments and contact information for the local agency that has applied for those other experiments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David to go through some of the interim approvals and actual experiments that are being conducted.
Great. Thanks very much, Bill. And Dave, I'm actually going to flip it right to your screen in a second. So if you're ready, you should see this come across, and you should be able to pick up from there.
Yeah, good to go. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Dan. And good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're viewing from today. All right, hopefully that's showing correctly.
Yep, you're all set.
Yeah, Bill's been, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying you're all set, Dave.
Great. Great. Yeah, Bill did a great job of explaining the experimental process. And what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about what the manual covers right now, what devices that have been kind of at the forefront of the discussion of bicycle facility design, those devices and how they fit into the manual right now. I do want to take a couple of slides just to talk about a little bit of background. And I know I'm going a little bit against the, presentation slide design 101. There's a lot of text on these slides, but I think it's important when you go back through this or when we look at it to see some of this background information. First of all, just to set a baseline, the absence of a bicycle facility, as discussed in the manual, does not mean that bicyclists are not permitted to travel on that roadway. Jurisdictions only prohibit bicycle travel on a roadway with specific prohibitions, and those are usually done with signs. And in some Western states, in fact, you'll see that bicycle travel is even permitted on interstate shoulders because that's simply the only way to get from place A to B. But that makes it even more important for us as designers to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to accommodate bicyclists on every road that we can, with the facilities and with some common sense that are available to us. So looking at Part 9 specifically, when we look at traffic control devices for bicyclists, they do come back to the basic principles of traffic control device design that we use throughout the MUTCD, regardless of if they're intended for bicyclists or motor vehicles or pedestrians. Those devices have to fulfill a need, they have to command attention, they have to convey a clear and simple meaning, they command respect from road users, and the installation gives adequate time for a proper response. And when we look at the lens of a new device or an innovative device, and including those that we're asked to allow an experiment with, these are the check boxes, these are the criteria through which we're looking at that. These are what we use to evaluate whether that device should move forward as designed. So I want to talk about a few devices that have been used increasingly in design, but there's been some ambiguity about their status under the manual and their status for use by jurisdictions. But these devices are actually compliant with the 2009 manual without any additional approval from federal highways, provided they are used in a compliant manner. And that's because, as we'll go through, these are based on principles found in other sections of the manual as well, especially through the pavement markings chapter. So let's talk first about bike lane extension. You're going to hear me come back to this point a few times in the next coming slides. But under the MUTCD, bike lanes are considered preferential lanes, like a hot lane, like HOV or transit lanes, except that bike lanes are designated for the exclusive use of bicyclists. All of the provisions that cover preferential lane markings and the required elements, the standards that define a preferential lane, are found in Chapter 3D. But we're going to talk about bike lanes specifically here. When you go back to 3D, you'll see that lane extension markings are addressed there, and it provides some guidance on where and when to use those. Specifically when design or visibility constraints make it important to provide guidance through intersections. My control panel out of the way, thanks. One element we're starting to see in bike lane extensions are chevrons, similar to they're used for the shared lane marking. Those used in that manner are not compliant with the MUTCD. What we would use in those situations instead are to place directional arrows appropriately sized for bike facility to indicate the direction within the bike lane extension. And I've got a picture that'll show you what I'm talking about here. This is a good use of a bike lane extension except for those chevrons that you'll see here, but they do indicate how this bike lane comes from the far side of the screen and changes its alignment a little bit as it goes through to the near side of the screen. So it's important to have those extension markings, those broken lines, as they cross the intersection to help the bicyclists find their way across. And not only that, it helps the drivers and pedestrians identify that there's a facility that's crossing here. The one element we would change again is that the chevrons in this case are not in the manual and are non-compliant for use in a lane extension. What we would rather have is something like this photo here. You see you've got the bike symbol in the lane extension and you've got a bike lane arrow used within the lane extension as well to indicate the directionality. One thing we'll talk about in a little bit is you'll see that this one, not a great picture for it, but green color pavement is used in this bike lane extension, which is allowed under Interim Approval 14, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another device that we're starting to see quite a lot of is a buffered bike lane. Buffered bike lanes are used when you don't necessarily have the ability to create a physical buffer between motor vehicle traffic and bike lane, but where you do want to create some additional separation. They can also be used in the case where you may have crossings that are required. If you have on-street parking on one side, but you still want to provide a buffer for bicyclists from motor vehicle traffic. And so in thinking about the design of a buffered bike lane, again, you go back to 3D, which provides the principles behind buffering a preferential lane. Because at the end of the day, like I said, bike lanes are just a type of preferential lane, and the design concept comes back to the same that are used for all preferential lanes. You see a couple of examples here on the screen, and this is straight from Chapter 3D, where you can use chevron markings to fill the space if it's wider than about 4 feet, or you can use 2 wide single lanes. Where you use the wide lanes, it communicates that the crossing of that is discouraged. So that's one where if you have parking one side and you use the 2 wide single lanes, they can still cross that to access the on-street parking. The chevrons are used where you would want to prohibit crossing that. So, think about providing brakes in that line where you have on-street parking on one side. Another device we're seeing a lot, especially in urban areas, is a counterflow bike lane. And again, I'll go back that bike lanes are still preferential lanes. And so when we look for a template for marking counterflow bike lanes, you go back to 3D, which does provide an example on how to do that. It's important in this case to highlight another principle that's found in Chapter 3D, in that what designates the standard that designates a preferential lane is the symbol or word marking that defines what that lane is. A lot of agencies will use a bike lane sign. That is a supplemental item, but what actually establishes the lane, and this is true for not only bike lanes but all other preferential lanes, what actually establishes the lane is the bike symbol or the word markings that'll say bike lane to establish that lane. So when you do a counterflow lane, it's even more important to establish that the only two-way traffic that is allowed in this lane is bikes, and so you have to make sure you get the symbol or word marking there to establish that. One thing you can also do here is use a do not enter sign with a plaque below that says accept bikes. And under the manual where there's no adequate symbol sign that exists for a purpose, you are permitted to create a custom word message plaque such as accept bikes to help define that situation.
Dave, I wonder if I can cut in a moment. Sorry to interrupt you. We've got a few questions, sort of clarifying questions on the buffered bike lane example, and I thought it might be easiest while we have the visual at our fingertips here to go back to that, have me ask you those. One of them asks, does the information here mean that the chevrons that you're showing in the top figure, are they only used for 4 feet or wider buffers, and a narrower buffer would not need the chevron?
This doesn't, so I'd have to go back and double check the text. My recollection is that this is not a requirement, that if you choose to put markings within a buffer space that's narrower than 4 feet, you can still do so. That becomes difficult logistically just because of actually accessing the space to do so. I can double check that once we're in the question and answer period later on. I should note that we are, if you've seen a couple of years ago, we had a proposal for a proposed amendment to Part 9 that was going around, and this is one of the areas that we are looking to clarify how to do design for these specific situations, especially the buffered bike lanes with the buffers narrower than 4 feet. We are still considering a rewrite to that section in order to address that specifically, because we understand that, again, that physically it's difficult to mark those chevrons once you get in a smaller space. So one consideration we're seriously considering is to allow diagonal hatching even when the direction doesn't make sense necessarily for having same direction travel on both sides, but when it's bicycles on one side and we want to make sure to help emphasize that buffer, we are considering revising that guidance. So this is what exists now, and it applies to all preferential lanes, but again, we are looking at this specifically for a rewrite to Part 9 as we're able to move forward with a new edition.
Okay, and the follow-up question from another person was asking about whether those lines where you're using the chevrons, if those have to be the double white lines or if they can be single white lines on either side of the buffer.
They can be single white lines on either side. You can also use a wide double white line to indicate a prohibition, just like you would for an HOV or hot lanes. But you can use a single wide white lane on both sides of the buffer.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave.
Just a couple of more, as we go back to counterflow lanes, a couple of more examples on the design. These show the bike symbols I was talking about, as well as the accept bike plaques on the signs showing that the movements required to enter the counterflow lane are not permitted by motor vehicles. This is something, again, that we'll also likely address in much more detail as we move forward to a new edition of the manual. Separated bike lanes, as I'm sure to everybody's chagrin, are not addressed in the 2009 MUTCD. At the time, the design simply was not widespread, and as Bill alluded to in his presentation, this is one of the elements of design that's undergone a huge increase in popularity since the writing and release of the 2009 manual. Federal Highways has released a document called the Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide from our Office of Safety, and that includes a lot of design principles on how to design, how to lay out separated bike lanes, how to choose the directionality, how to choose which side of the street to locate your lane. So I would refer a lot of questions to that. When it comes to the principles and when it comes to the traffic control devices used for separated bike lanes, the intersection treatments vary. A lot of the ones that we've talked about are in play. Bike lane extensions I would strongly recommend when using with separated bike lanes, as well as green colored pavement, which is under interim approval. When you have something like a separated bike lane whose alignment is not necessarily expected by drivers, especially those on the crossing street, it's important to highlight those crossings, as well as how you mark the buffer. For example, you see in this image on our cover from the separated bike lane guide, you can see how the buffer design adheres to that principle that I was showing a little bit earlier. As well as the channelizing devices themselves, which are covered in 3H. And 3H will provide all of the guidelines for choosing, flexible delineators or what have you, or the different types of devices you might choose to use. I'll also give a plug to the Massachusetts DOT Separated Bike Lane Design Guide, which is an excellent document as well to look at for design of separated bike lanes. I'd like to move now to the devices under interim approval. As Bill noted in his presentation, a lot of the interim approvals that have been issued since the 2009 manual was released have been focused on this area, bicycle facilities, because simply it is just one of the, it's probably the most active and most changing area of transportation design we've had in the last few years. To be clear, when we have interim approvals, these are devices that jurisdictions must apply for to use. These are optional. The existence of an interim approval does not compel a jurisdiction to allow its use. They must request approval from Federal Highways and receive that. If you are a local jurisdiction, I encourage you to check with your state or your FHWA division for how the process works for you individually. For example, in California, localities are not permitted to request interim approval directly. Rather, that is done by Caltrans on behalf of all local jurisdictions in the state. So again, that does vary depending on where you are and your jurisdiction. So I encourage you to check with your state DOT or Federal Highways division in your state to see how that would apply to you. This one, interim approval 14 for green colored pavement, you're probably all familiar with at this point. It allows for the use of green colored pavement in marked bicycle lanes and in the extensions of bicycle lanes. The testing for this showed universally positive operational effects in not only recognizing bicyclists, but then for drivers to recognize the space in which bicyclists can be expected to operate. And you'll see as we've introduced new devices for interim approval, we have applied interim approval 14 to those as well. So when interim approval of 14 was written, we wrote it to be used in marked bicycle lanes and the extension of bicycle lanes. We've adapted that for a couple of interim approvals we've released since then, which I'll talk about when we get to those. Here's a couple of examples. The writing of interim approval provides flexibility on how you choose to apply the green colored pavement to the lane itself. You can choose a solid green installation within the line, or you can choose to, like the left example, for example, we have a broken edge line where traffic is permitted to merge across. That can be done solid as shown in the photo, or that could be done in a broken pattern to coincide with the edge line in that case. I will tell you that as we contemplate an update to Part 9, we are likely going to include some kind of guidance statement, depending on the strength we choose to give it, but some kind of encouragement to make the green pattern match the edge line adjacent to it, just for additional emphasis in the change of the marking pattern. So that's probably the way that's going to go in the future, but you do have the flexibility to do either type of installation right now. Interim Approval 15 was developed by the National Committee, as Bill was saying earlier. This is one that the demand was demonstrated to the National Committee and came to FHWA from that direction. We also heard from the states. The primary reasoning behind this was that we wanted to emphasize that this bike route number was part of a national level bike route system, which wasn't communicated in the previous sign. So you can see the alternative sign on the bottom that indicates it's a U.S. bike route, not just a local or state route. Interim Approval 16 allows us for the use of a bicycle signal face, a bicycle signal indication. Part 9 had already allowed, as written, for the use of a standard circular traffic signal face to control bicycle facilities, and you would put a regulatory plaque below the signal that indicated it was a bicycle signal. What Interim Approval 16 allows for is the use of a bicycle-shaped signal face. Interim Approval 16, as written, does restrict the operation of bicycle signal faces where there are not conflicting motor vehicle movements. So situations where you have a bicycle movement that's controlled by a bicycle signal face, you cannot have a potentially conflicting motor vehicle movement. So for example, if a bike lane controlled by a bike signal face were to the right of a through right lane, that through right lane would have to have a red arrow for the right turn movement, or it would have to be separated into a right turn bay and have a red arrow. We have heard a lot of feedback from cities that this operation simply isn't practical, that the requirement for the restriction of motor vehicle movements across a bicycle movement controlled by a bike signal simply introduces too much delay into the intersections, and they can't get approval from the signal engineering staff to be able to install those because you're introducing so much delay into the system. As a result of this pretty significant feedback we received, we are allowing experimentation with with permissive motor vehicle movements across bicycle movements controlled by bicycle signal faces. I believe we have 3 or 4 experiments open right now. Those are taking different forms. Some are using green bicycle indications where you have conflicting movements. Some are using flashing yellow bicycle indications. And in most cases, we're also asking that for the motor vehicle movements that conflict with the bicycle movement, they include a flashing yellow arrow to indicate an additional level of conflict as those motorists try to make that turn. This is another one, for example, when we have these experiments that we're also strongly encouraging the use of clearly marked lane extensions and green colored pavement where possible to highlight the presence of that bike lane as an additional conflict that motorists are turning across. So we're anxiously awaiting the first progress reports from those experiments out there to see how ultimately we move forward with Interim Approval 16. New as of last year, we have Interim Approval 18 for what we're calling intersection bicycle boxes. These are bike boxes at the head of an approach, and what these do is facilitate bicyclists positioning themselves at an intersection for the maximum visibility for drivers. What we found is that there were many cases where you'd have motor vehicles stop, a bicyclist would pull up alongside to the right. When they get the simultaneous green, the motorist doesn't always see the bicyclist to their right. It's also very difficult when arriving on a red for a bicyclist to position themselves in an approach such as you see here to make a left turn. So the bike box allows a bicyclist arriving on red to be able to position themselves in front of a motor vehicle to be able to have both the visibility and the positioning to make a left turn. From the research that was conducted on this, we showed, but the experimental studies showed that there were reduced conflicts between bicyclists and turning drivers. There was a reduction in the amount of avoidance maneuvers conducted between bicyclists and drivers on both sides, and the advanced stop line reduced the encroachments of motor vehicles into crosswalks. Our latest interim approval, not to be confused with intersection bicycle boxes, is a 2-stage bicycle turn box. This is one of those that we've probably had the most research based on. We've been very fortunate to have a lot of participation in the experimental process of this device as well. And the experiment, I'll talk a little bit about how those have directly led to the way the interim approval was written in this case. But a 2-stage bike turn box is an area set aside from moving vehicle paths, both motor vehicle and bicycle, for a bicyclist to queue to make a turn. When I talk about it, I generally just refer to it as to make a left turn because that is the most common use, but this can also be used from a left side bike lane to make a right turn. But when you hear me talk about it in the presentation, I'll probably just refer to it as a left just to make everything more consistent. What it does is allows the bicyclist to make a turn, in this case a left turn, without merging across potentially multiple lanes of traffic or other hazards you might have while merging. The way it works, seen in this rendering, a bicyclist will approach in a standard on-street bike lane. They will pull into the box, offset from the motor vehicle path. You'll notice that in this case, where we have the bike box in front of a motor vehicle approach from the north-south approach, that we have a turn on red restriction for those motorists so that those motorists and bicyclists cannot pass through that space. That queuing space is protected from motor vehicles and from other bicyclists, so it's set aside from all of those moving vehicle paths. That's the critical element in the placement of these boxes. And then once you get the signal for the cross street, the bicyclist is turned within the box and they will continue after making that left turn without having to merge into traffic. So the previous example I showed you is kind of its most simple application. Here's one where we see a lot of opportunity and a lot of need for this type of treatment. So you'll notice in this example, we'll call up, down, north, south. In this example, the northbound left turn is prohibited. You cannot make a left turn there. So in order to make a left turn in this case, the bicyclist is required to use the turn box. We've provided, in this example, signing, at both advanced signing and at the intersection for a jurisdiction where this is required. The signing for the mandatory use of the turn box, as well as, and I'll just go back here, we've also provided signing should a jurisdiction make the use of the turn box optional for some bicyclists who choose to use it. There's a lot of situations where the use of the bike box would be extremely advantageous, and some of that is coming from some of the things we're starting to see in the updates to transportation design, especially bike facilities. So I'll give a couple of examples. As I said earlier, we're seeing a lot more physically separated bike lanes. You may have a physical buffer for a bike lane that continues up to an intersection. A bicyclist cannot merge out of that in many cases, and so making a two-stage left turn is the only way for them to make that turn, and this device helps normalize that process. You have a lot more urban rail systems, light rail or streetcar systems that are located either in the center of the lane or in the left traffic lane or even in the right traffic lane, where a bicyclist merging across those tracks is put at risk by the angle and getting their tire trapped in the track, so we don't want to encourage that movement. This provides a way for the bicyclist to make that turn at more of a 90-degree angle, which is a much safer crossing. And you also have this, as shown here in this example, you've got multiple lane merges or high-speed roadways where a bicyclist merging across 2 or 3 lanes of traffic is not a desirable condition. What we learned from the experimentation that led to interim approval 20 was that this process is already going on in a lot of locations without boxes being installed. And some vehicle codes across the country already have provisions for this, and Virginia specifically does have this in their code, is one I can think of off the top of my head. What we're trying to do here with this device is formalize that operation. And what we found through the experimentation process was that when these were installed, the process was fairly intuitive. When we requested experimentation with this device, or when we were requested for a jurisdiction to do experimentation, we didn't ask that they specifically use the sign. And what we found from experimentation was that once these were installed, the use kind of normalized fairly quickly. And that the factor we saw most that led to bicyclists making a two-stage turn but not within the box was actually the level of crowding. The amount of bicyclists in the box was simply too high for it to fit. That was considered a good sign, but mostly what was considered a very good sign for us was that these seem to be very intuitive based on the research that we received. We do make sign use mandatory in a case like this one, where the use of the turn box is mandatory, where you're not permitted to make that left turn in any other manner. Otherwise, based on the intuitive nature of the device, we've made the signing optional, but should people choose to use the signing, we did provide a template for that. I want to talk a little bit more, just to close out, on some very common experimental devices we're seeing. Kind of these are the most common experiments we've been seeing. And just a reminder, as Bill talked about earlier, you can find all of the guidance and requirements for experimentation in section 1A.10. As I said earlier, we're seeing a lot of experiments with bicycle signals allowing conflicting movements across the bicycle movement. We're hoping that this leads to some constructive data that we can use to potentially modify or IA-16 or potentially reinforce that the restriction in IA-16 is the right thing to do. And so hopefully we'll have more information as those experiments move forward. What we're looking at with those experiments is when you have a conflicting movement, do both motorists and bicyclists understand what the conflicts are and understand their rights and responsibilities at the location. What we're asking of jurisdictions is that they focus on the critical items, and this is true for all experiments. What we ask jurisdictions to do, and what we try to do when jurisdictions request to do an experiment, is we identify what is the critical thing that we're trying to find out from this experiment. So in this case, what we're really trying to isolate are those conflicts and interactions between motor vehicles and bicyclists where we permit those conflicts, seeing which party yields and seeing if both parties understand what their rights and responsibilities are. And as I said earlier, we are encouraging flashing yellow arrows to be shown to motorists to indicate that additional degree of conflict. Greenback shared lane markings. As I said earlier, Interim Approval 14 reserves green-colored pavement for the use in bike lanes and bike lane extensions. We did write our approvals for both type of bike boxes, that if you do receive approval for the bike boxes, you are allowed to use green-colored pavement with those as well. But we have been requested to allow green-colored pavement with shared lane markings. So what we have, our reason for leaving that out was that in every other use, green-colored pavement indicates a space where bicyclists are allowed and other use is restricted. Motorists can only cross those spaces, such as turning across a bike lane, but they cannot drive within them. The use of green-colored pavement with a shared lane marking would be a change from that operation. It would be a facility indicated by green pavement where motorists are allowed to drive as well. So what we're interested to learn from our experiments and the factors that we're asking jurisdictions to isolate is the operation of the shared lane improved. So to quantify that, we ask for the bicyclist positioning within the lane. Are they moving closer to the center of the marking? Excuse me. The lane change behavior on the part of the motorist. How are they behaving around the bicyclist when you include that green-colored pavement? What is the passing distance provided by motorists for bicyclists? And just the effect of the perception of green coloring through intercept surveys, asking a motorist or a bicyclist, what does that green coloring mean? This goes back to the principle I was saying previously, in that when we do an experiment, what we try to do is burden the jurisdiction as little as possible, but isolate the factor that we're trying to learn about. So in this case, the only difference we're trying to learn between the installations before and after, as you can see in the graphic, is what effects does that green-colored pavement have? And we try to work with the jurisdictions to ask for the minimum amount of observation and research required to just isolate that factor, which is what we're trying to learn about. Finally, we'll talk about advisory bike lanes. These are used for roadways that are too narrow for a standard bike lane and a two-way roadway. The intended operation is that motorists would drive in the center lane between the dashed bike lanes, and they would merge into those bike lanes only to pass one another. So in the standard operation, the motorist is driving past the bicyclist, they stay outside that dashed lane. The potential conflict doesn't occur unless there is a passing movement between two motor vehicles that are coming in opposite directions. We have allowed several experiments with these so far. The picture I've included here is from an experimental installation in Virginia. We have mixed results in US experimentation so far, and we do have some additional experiments underway. But the concern we've had is, at least from one of the experiments that's happened so far, is that the drivers didn't necessarily understand that they were supposed to be in that center portion of the roadway. So one of the experimental locations, we saw drivers would consistently drive with their passenger side wheel within that dashed bike lane. And that's of significant concern to us, because that goes against the fundamental reason for the operation in the first place, which is to create that space on the roadway for bicyclists. But given the widespread use of this treatment in other countries around the world, we do think it has potential, and we are interested to learn more about it. So this is one that we will probably approve additional experiments on, and we're also going to be doing some additional research, likely through other venues, to create some kind of signing, potentially marking, to help both drivers and bicyclists understand their rights and responsibilities in the operation of this kind of facility. So this is just a clip from the website that Bill had mentioned earlier. which we'll provide a link to afterwards that's hosted through our Office of Safety. But we have a quick summary of what is allowable through the 2009 manual, what is not allowable, and then treatments that are not considered traffic control devices, so the MUTCD doesn't address them directly. So that's, for example, a separated bike lane is not technically a traffic control device. The traffic control devices are what help define that. Medians are not traffic control devices, bike networks, things like that. So this is all available on the website we were talking about earlier. And then here are some resources we linked to earlier. This is all available in the presentation documents, which you'll get later on. And that'll be it for my slides. I think we're a little bit early on the presentation portion, so we'll be able to take questions.
Yeah, no, that's great, Dave. Thank you. And like I said, plenty of questions to go around, so we can get right into that. Let me move the screen back to my screen now. And I wanted to, as we start, I want to get back. We'll come back to the bicycle treatments that you've been discussing because we got a lot of questions about those. But I wanted to circle back to just the experimentation process in general, and ask Bill. Go back to Bill, I guess. And Bill, when a request for experimentation is submitted, and that's being reviewed and possibly approved, by FHWA. What sort of elements are being used to determine whether or not to allow that experimentation? Is there a plan for experiment submitted, or a data collection plan or evaluation plan submitted, and you're evaluating that? Or are you looking more at the treatment and existing research on that treatment to allow? Can you talk a little bit more about how an experimentation might be approved or not approved?
Well, my experience in submitting or preparing requests for clients has been to do pretty much what you said, to gather as much information on background, any past performance, what's happening with other experiments out there, what's happening with uses that are in place but haven't gone through the experimental process, just to try and give Federal Highway as much information as possible to help them, determine whether that would be approved. But I think David touched on the key issue is, what key element are we trying to find out in terms of the operational safety benefits of this particular device, and is it will it live up to the intended performance with both motorized and non-motorized users. So I think, again, that the website that Federal Highway has put up offers specific guidance on the different types of experiments, some of the more popular experiments out there. So I would encourage users to not only read section 1A.10 in the manual, but also refer to that status web page for the specific treatment and the guidelines that Federal Highway is putting out there. And they pretty much, in my opinion, lay out what information they're looking for.
Yeah,
and I will just add one thing: is a lot of times when the requests come in, David sends them to the bike committee and for review and comment, and so you get the advantage of not only Federal Highway's take on what's happening in that area, but also the 24+ members of the bike committee that come from all sections of the U.S. also can add in their experience.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that as well, that when we're looking at experiment requests, in addition to everything else that's submitted to us when we consider an experiment request, what we're looking for, and it's referred to in section 1A.10, is we're looking for how does this address something that the manual either doesn't address at all or doesn't address adequately. What we're looking for is how does the proposed device or how does the proposed use address that gap in the guidance that we have available. And there are definitely gaps in the manual, and things like two-stage turn boxes have come out of that absence that's available now. And so when we consider it, that's the first and most important thing, is that we don't want to necessarily approve something that's just for use because it's different, because we think, you know, this is different than the other one, but we'd like to use this one instead, because that gets back to the uniformity concept that we talked about earlier, that these trap control devices have to be simple and easily recognized, which is why there may be alternative ways of signing things, for example, that have the same effect, but we're always going to stick with one uniform use to be able to have that instant recognition. And so when we evaluate an experiment request, that's the most important thing we look at, is that how is it addressing something that's not addressed currently. And from there, you know, if you ever have a question, you can contact me directly, and I'll be happy to help, you know, shape an experimental plan, or kind of get to the potential issue, or get to an experiment that we can approve. Because in some cases we'll get a request that we can't necessarily approve as is, but with a few changes, or with a little change to the plan, we can then get to an approvable experiment. So we're happy to work with individual jurisdictions on their experimental plans, because ultimately it benefits us as well as the state of the practice as well.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate those responses. Staying on that topic of the process and the approvals, when an agency were to submit a request, what's typically the timeline that they would hear back on whether it was approved, and how often do you usually, what do you have a ballpark for typically how long it takes for that approval to be granted for experimentation until you're able to review results and kind of make a decision about whether to grant an interim approval for a device? What sort of timeline should people be expecting?
So we try to get back initially with comments within a couple of weeks, just based on when we're able to review and approve it. And some of that comes from, it's not only usually, for example, if it's a Part 9 experiment, it's not only usually me that'll approve it, but if there are new signs involved, I'll consult with other members of the team, or if there's bike signals, then Bruce Friedman, who's our signal expert, will often take the lead on that. So there's a lot of consultation going on within the team, as well as with other experts at federal highways in areas that we're not necessarily the most qualified to judge. So there is, you know, there's a lot of consulting going on within federal highways. So usually a couple weeks before you'll get an initial response with comments or something like that. And then we hope to get everything wrapped up not too long after that. As far as leading to an interim approval, we don't typically come with a time for that, just because every potential interim approval is different, and different weights are given to different things. Different weights are given to different treatments depending on, for example, the inherent risk. I think you'll see a pretty deliberative process, for example, when it looks at updating interim approval 16, because we are allowing significant additional degree of conflict in that case between where you have a potential right angle collision between a motor vehicle and a bicyclist. And so we want to make sure that we've got the experimentation and the results and the research to justify that that's a safe operation before we alter the interim approval to allow that potentially. So something like that, I think, would be on a little bit of a longer timeline. As far as when we receive results from experiments, that can vary a lot, just depending on, you know, whatever happens between the designer, the local agency, and us. Then it's also, you know, there's this entirely separate timeline that the local agency has based on their project implementation. So what we do is we request periodic progress reports from an agency. But I think here's where one of the potential misconceptions about the process comes in. If an agency has requested approval for an experiment from us, and it's been 6 months, their semi-annual update is due to us, and they haven't been able to move forward because the procurement process, because the money's not coming until the next fiscal year, that's not an issue for us. We just need to hear from them in a quick email saying, hey, we haven't started construction yet because of X, Y, Z. That's all that we need to satisfy our process requirements. So it varies pretty widely between jurisdictions and between experiments, you know, depending on how soon we can get updates. So there's not really one timeline on that. But all that we ask is that each jurisdiction does stay in regular contact with us through the progress report process, so we can make sure that everything's still on track and things are being implemented as we discussed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's really helpful. And I wonder about that, the funding for these project or the experiments that are being done, the local agencies installing these projects and collecting this data. Are these typically self-funded efforts on behalf of the jurisdictions, or is there funding that comes along with the request to experiment, or are there, maybe if there aren't, you may have tips on where people can go to maybe access some funding to help them support this process? Because I think that the impression is that for a smaller community or a mid-sized city may not have a lot of resources on hand to do a lot of data collection and a lot of work to evaluate projects. Is there additional help out there that they could be tapping into?
So as far as the MUTCD team who's responsible for the experimentation, we don't have any funding that's distributed directly to experimenting cities or jurisdictions. That's not something that we're equipped to do. We don't have funding available for that. What we do have is we conduct research separately through both the Traffic Control Device Pooled Fund Study and as well the new Pedestrian and Bicycle Pooled Fund Study that's going to get started later this year through the Office of Human Environment is taking the lead on that one as well. And with that second one, what we're really trying to do is initially focus on devices that can be of significant impact to jurisdictions when they're looking at pedestrian and bicycle facilities, specifically those that are potentially at issue with the MUTCD. So I'll give you an example. Is the R10-15 sign, which is used a lot for bike lanes, which is modified often in a non-compliant fashion to include both the pedestrian and bicycle symbol. We have no research saying that as modified, that sign communicates that a bike lane is coming up along the side of a driver in addition to a crosswalk. So one of the things we'd like to study is what drivers take away from seeing that sign when you say that turning vehicles must yield to bicyclists, whether it adequately conveys the degree of the conflict. And so that's something we're hoping to turn around through our internal research process that we fund. When it comes to cities themselves, unfortunately, like I said, we don't have any funding that's available to distribute directly to agencies looking to experiment. But I would also caution that, I mean, having been on the other side of the experimental process myself as a practitioner in the past, there is a degree of work involved in the process, of course, but I think that in working with Federal Highway Administration and working with your state DOT, we can help to design an experimental plan that reduces the burden as much as possible to a series of peak hour observations, and we can really kind of drill down to what the observations are to make it the minimum required, but that would also get a meaningful result for us. And I think quite often the degree of work that's required to go through the experimental process is not quite as onerous as many jurisdictions think. I recently received a package in the mail that was about 110 pages for an experimental request, and while I appreciate the level of effort, that is in no way what is required. What's required in an experiment request is very simple. A simple experimentation plan telling us what data you'll be collecting, a rendering of the device or how you would use an existing device in a different manner, and a potential project timeline. An experimentation plan saying that once it's installed, we'll collect X, Y, Z. Before installation, we'll collect the same data, compare before and after. And like I said, we're happy to work with the jurisdiction to really refine that to the absolutely essential data. So while we're not able to assist jurisdictions directly financially, this is something that we do regularly work with jurisdictions on to make sure that we can help scale something that's appropriate to the level of resources that they have available. And I would also encourage, one thing we see a lot from jurisdictions, and we've seen in some of our experimentation over the last few years, is if you have a local university with a transportation department or even otherwise, if you can potentially partner to get, I don't want to say free labor, but let's say free labor, to get some students out there to do observation for you at peak hour or something like that. That's often a source of help that jurisdictions can tap into when they are in need of just manpower for observations. That's often something that jurisdictions are able to do. And then sometimes you can also help use that. You can help use the students as well to do some of the research on your behalf. So I would encourage jurisdictions to tap the resources that they have available in addition to working with us to kind of develop the best experimentation plan for both of us.
Great. Yeah, that's really a good response. I think that answers a lot of questions that came in, and I think that you're probably on the same page or of the same opinion that you wouldn't want the experimentation, the data collection, to be something that stood in the way of getting really good results. Because I think that's what this is all about: is making sure that we can find out the most we can about new and innovative things to help fill those gaps. One question that has come in a few times is, when you think about the and Bill, jump in here too if you've got a thought on this. When you're looking at the landscape of what we know and then what we don't know, and treatments that we maybe have not much information about, how much are agencies looking to examples from outside of the U.S., so maybe European examples, and those who may be leading the way, where we may not have used these treatments before. Are a lot of your experiment requests coming in ideas that have been working in Europe and that we just want to make sure they can work here? Can you speak to that international example?
This is Bill. I think a lot of what we're doing is coming from Europe, but I guess I would caution that there's a lot more to what we're doing than just the signs, markings, and the signals. There's vehicle codes and just local customs zoning regulations and roadway design standards that impact placement of a traffic control device. So I think that we're definitely looking at those treatments over there and figuring out the reality of life here in the U.S., but also, use them as sort of a guideline to point us in the right direction. But again, I would caution that it's not a case of just picking up something and then, from Europe and airdropping it into an intersection in the U.S. and expecting it to work to the same level that it does over there. So a good guideline, but I think things need to be adapted to the U.S. definitely.
Okay. Yeah, one example that comes to mind, or one that I'm hearing a lot about now that's becoming more and more popular, you mentioned separated bike lanes, protected intersections, as they're referred to, a few different names, junctions, a few others. Those seem to be getting more and more popular as well. Fewer examples here so far, right now at least, and I'm wondering if you're seeing requests to experiment around certain components of a protected intersection, if those are being looked at currently.
So that's actually a good point to bring up that I should include in future presentations as well. The concept of a protected intersection is one of those things that falls into not defined under the MUTCD. So as we typically see these protected intersections, the elements of which are really the geometric design. So the protection islands that are included, kind of the pork chop islands or the kidney bean shaped islands, whatever you want to call them, at the four corners of the intersection that kind of separate out bicyclists and pedestrians and also force a tighter turning radius for motorists. That's not a concept that's included in the MUTCD. That's something that falls within geometric design. What we look at from a traffic control devices standpoint is how you define what devices you use to define the space where the pedestrians and bicyclists are. So for something like the design that's in, I believe, Salt Lake City and both the one that was put in Texas, my recollection is that both of those use compliant devices with the MUTCD, things like the green pavement coloring and high visibility crosswalk markings. And that's the primary difference between those and those protected intersections, other intersections, is again that geometric design element. So that's not something that necessarily MUTCD would at all preclude using. And I would just encourage people who are interested in learning about those treatments to just take an inventory through, take a check through once the design is complete and see if those TCDs that you've installed are all compliant as existing, because that may not even come into the experimental process. I would also say that, my understanding is that this is being done, but just because it's not within the MUTCD experimental process doesn't mean that it's not, very important and very helpful to the state of the practice to have that study done on the intersection as well. It's just that unless it's non-compliant with the MUTCD, we're not something that's going to stand in the way or necessarily have a stake in the implementation of that design. So at least for the protected intersections, that's something that definitely falls under the standpoint of geometric design versus traffic control device experimentation.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think people confuse the MUTCD with other design guidance documents out there, like the National Bike Guide and the National Green Book. The MUTCD is really not a design manual. It's for the placement of traffic control devices. I will tell you though that the Bicycle Committee is looking at the two separated bike lane guides, the Federal Highway and the Mass DOT, and going through those to see if there are areas where we need to address traffic control devices, signs, markings, signals specific to separated bike lanes. So I think David hit it right on that a protected intersection is really a geometric feature, not a traffic control device.
Well, you raise a good point there, Bill, and it's one that the three of us discussed before the webinar, and I wanted to get your take on it. There seems to be some confusion maybe within what's laid out in the MUTCD between what is sort of a standard, something required to follow, what is guidance, and what is optional. And I pose the question to you all, and Dave, we may start with you, but are there misconceptions that you see kind of coming up time and time again in practitioners interpreting the MUTCD maybe incorrectly, or maybe holding fast to something that actually is guidance, and you don't necessarily, there is flexibility there, but people may not know that?
Sure. So speaking more generally, when we define guidance in the manual, that is something that is strongly recommended and should only be deviated from based on engineering judgment. And so when we say engineering judgment, that's something that we expect when an engineer chooses to go against guidance in the manual, that they have a valid reason, that they've studied that location. But that flexibility is there. If an engineer decides for whatever reason to go against that guidance, they can do so, provided they've adequately studied that location. So the most common example of this that I see time and time again is the signal warrants in Part 4. The signal warrants are guidance. They are not a standard. I think it's expedient for engineers to look at those and say that, well, it doesn't meet warrants, I'm not going to install a signal. Or it meets warrants, so I'm going to go put in a signal, and kind of stop there. Those warrants are guidance. And an engineer having a good reason to do so can install a signal when it's not justified by those warrants, or vice versa. Even if a warrant is justified, maybe they don't install a signal. Maybe they're concerned about the specific type of crashes that can be encouraged by installing a signal, or maybe there have been too many pedestrian crashes, so even though a signal is not justified, they'll go ahead and install it anyway, even though it didn't meet the warrant. So that's probably the one that comes up the most often, I think, as far as misconceptions go. But I think generally there is that kind of, I don't want to say misconception, but misconception in practice that a guidance statement is a standard. It is not, but you do have to have a valid engineering reason for going against the guidance, and that should be documented in case it comes up at a later time.
No, that's really valuable. Bill, I don't know if you have any other ones that you might point to, or
well, David covered that completely. I would just urge people to refer to section 1A13 in the manual, which is the definition section, and the first definitions are standards, guidance, and options. Define exactly what those mean. So I do find a lot of folks consider guidance, which David said, is a recommendation that with deviation allowed based on engineering judgment, they'd consider that to be a standard, which is, a statement of mandatory compliance. So I think folks need to look beyond, Part 9 for bicycle facilities when you're thinking about traffic control devices, and refer to some of the other sections.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for that. There was one question that I wanted to clarify, the question about timeline we asked earlier, and if I can track it down. So the question to clarify the timeline question earlier from, if an interim approval already exists and a jurisdiction applies to use one, how long does that process usually take?
That should be relatively quick, depending on if it's a locality and there's already an existing approval within that state, then that's just the time for us to get the letter in front of the appropriate person for signature and turn it around to send back to the jurisdiction. If it is the first application from within a state, it does take a little bit longer, just because we like to contact the state DOT and make sure they're aware that the locality is applying for interim approval, just in case the state wants to necessarily take the lead and apply for the approval themselves. I didn't mention earlier, but a state is free to apply for interim approval either on their roadways alone, or they can apply for approval on behalf of all jurisdictions. And so when we get that first letter from a state, from within a state, from a locality, we do check with the state DOT to see if that's something they want to do. So that first approval from within a state can sometimes take a little bit longer, but usually it's just the time for us to process the letter, get it in front of the right person for signature and approval, and then get it transmitted out. So that's usually a relatively short turnaround.
Okay. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate it. I wanted to get back to some of the specific treatments that you talked about, Dave. So, the left turn box, the left turn queue box specifically. There was a question that came in about a sign that I think in some of the cities that were testing this treatment out, they had used maybe a different sign than what was ultimately included with the interim approval. I think I sent you a link to it, Dave. I'm wondering if you're familiar with this sign and maybe why it wasn't used, but a different one was used in the final interim approval. If you can talk about that process.
Yeah, I think I know the one you're talking about. I didn't get a chance to click the link, but it's a symbol sign showing the movement. And we did discuss the use of that sign, but for symbol signs, what we really like to do is before we introduce a new symbol sign, we like to make sure that we have at least some human factors research justifying that people understand the meaning of that symbol. And the people we kind of spoke to about the sign, we did do a little bit of conversing with the National Committee on this subject as well. Didn't always necessarily understand the fishhook arrow and didn't necessarily understand that was showing that all iterations of that sign were showing where to correctly position themselves, and if it implied the correct degree of traffic control once you got to the intersection. And we simply weren't comfortable with introducing the new symbol sign without fully understanding how people reacted to it. And so we did actually work with the National Committee on this one to develop the wording for these signs, and ultimately what was approved at the end of the day was, with the interim approval, was kind of a variation on the text we had originally included. And those signs, I want to make clear, the signs that are included in the interim approval for use of the two-stage turn box are not necessarily the final sign. And that's one that we're hoping to study a little bit further through those traffic control device pooled fund studies, to make sure that whatever sign we ultimately put out there and include in a future edition of the MUTCD clearly communicates what the box is for, when to use it, and where the location can be found at the intersection. And so in order to get something that would be implementable on a relatively short turnaround where we didn't necessarily have time to do the research, we chose to stick with a text-only sign that after discussions with the National Committee, we tried to make it as descriptive as possible for what was out there. We will be testing the graphical sign that was discussed among other variants as we go forward before a new edition is released, and that sign will likely change somewhat before a final adoption and a new edition of the manual. So this is intended as what was included because it was the clearest thing, the clearest, most descriptive sign plan that we could come up with to install without trusting that the research behind a symbol, which we simply didn't have on this turnaround.
Okay, thank you very much. The whole topic that we're talking about now with the two-stage left turn, you mentioned in the research and the study, you found that it seemed like this treatment was fairly intuitive for riders. People kind of figured out how to use that, and to some who were on the webinar, it may seem that that's somewhat of a confusing treatment or a confusing idea. The same maybe with a bike box. Someone rides upon a bike box, may not completely understand what it's used for or what it's intended to do. Can you speak at all to the role that maybe public education and outreach plays in any of this? If maybe it's not required in signage, but is there still maybe a role for agencies to do some education and outreach to road users to introduce these new treatments in a very coherent way, really explain what they're intended for?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's very important, and I think that's an area where I wish we had the capacity to do more in putting out kind of public-directed education and material. At the end of the day, the product that we're creating at Federal Highways for the MUTCD is intended for the practitioner, and we're not necessarily getting that last mile to the public to communicate what these traffic control devices are. We're relying on the state DOTs, and we're relying on the locals to be able to communicate that. I know that there are a lot of DOTs that are doing good PSAs and signage at intersections when users are stopped. They can see something like a sandwich board explaining what these devices are. I wish I had a good campaign that I could point to off the top of my head, but I've seen, and you can search for it on YouTube. I know I've seen some excellent PSAs about how to use a two-stage turn box, as well as at Bike Box. Portland, I believe, has done some good public outreach material on this one as well. But yeah, I completely agree that this is something that's very important to do, and I wish that we had the resources and capacity to kind of help out with this a little bit more, rather than leave it to the jurisdictions to implement them. But unfortunately, that's where we are with it right now. Bill, I don't know if you've seen anything that was valuable in this area that you could contribute as well.
Well, being a member of the League of American Bicyclists and a cycling instructor, we're going to be initiating some conversations with folks like them to sort of upgrade their education materials. Because when we were writing the proposal for the two-stage turn box that Federal Highway referred to when they developed the IA, along with other information, the key to me was that two-stage maneuver is legally allowed by vehicle codes in most states. So I think that was one of the reasons that it kind of was intuitive for people to adapt to, because in many cases that's how they were operating anyway, even without the box and the signs and whatnot. So I think a national focus by cycling advocates on how to use these new treatments that are coming out certainly would be very helpful, and we're going to start some discussions with those folks on doing exactly that.
Great. Yeah, and then for my own addition, I'd say I saw a really good PSA that I think Cambridge, Massachusetts did on using the two-stage turn box, and I thought it was great, very simple and easy to understand. Just making sure, I guess, information gets in front of people and in the places where they're looking for it. So I'm actually curious if those on the line have good examples of how they've maybe done some good outreach around some new treatments. If you could share those with us, we'd love to see those examples. So let us know in the chat pod if you have those. One question that I have for you, a request that came in for a few people is sometimes, you described the experimentation request, but I wonder if you all have any examples, maybe templates or maybe past examples that have been submitted and done well in the process. If you would be willing to share any of those, if folks reach out to you as sort of examples of what to shoot for. I can think of maybe examples of proposals that have been written and things like that can serve as examples for others, just so people know kind of what level of detail to go for. Does that exist out there anywhere, or is that something that could be shared?
It's not something that's on the website. We are actually working behind the scenes. So you'll notice if you go to our homepage, we do have a kind of an we call it the official rulings database, and experiments are considered official rulings. And so you can search for previous experiments based on parts of the manual, based on what edition. And what we'll do is we have on there the title of the experiment, the city that's doing it, the contact information, but what we don't have on there is the request. And actually right now we are working to update that database with all of the available requests that we have in electronic format, so that in the future, somebody looking to request experimentation will be able to go on our website, search for example, Part 9 in the 2009 edition, and they'll be able to see all of the experiments that came up with that, and they can refine that by keyword or several other possibilities. And so then they would be able to download the experiment request that came from that city for that device. We're hoping to get that done next year sometime, but in the meantime, I do this quite often. I'd say probably once a week at least, where a jurisdiction will email me and ask, hey, we're looking to experiment with green colored pavement and shared lane markings. And I'm happy to send along a request that we approved to use as a template, so they can easily adapt that for their use, so they can see something that we already approved of, that had already kind of gone through that refinement process. So yeah, please reach out to me if you have any questions or you'd like an example to be used. For the record, these are all public record. These are submitted to the government. If requested, we are happy to send along approved requests so that a jurisdiction can use them as a template to go forward and help us expand the knowledge base that's available. Yeah, so hopefully in the future we'll have something online that people can just go ahead and use for that purpose. But in the meantime, I'm your database. Feel free to email me and reach out, and I'm happy to send you examples to use to help craft an experiment.
Yeah, and I just dropped the link to the official rulings database in the chat pod in case anyone wants to check that out. It's really valuable. I've also been dropping the link to the page on the specific information about each of these bicycle treatments you've been talking about that kind of lays out all the details. So hopefully people can access that. I have a question about how, after you all do all of your work to determine what is approved and what is granted maybe interim approval and works its way into the manual, how does that, what is the process by which that information kind of trickles out to the state, to the division offices, to practitioners in the field? Obviously, it's not something that is immediately transitioned into practice, but I think folks would maybe be interested in knowing where they can be looking for the latest and best information on things that are approved, so that they can maybe work with their own states and their own cities to make sure that they get into their toolbox.
Sure. So what typically happens as far as directly from us, and I'll use an interim approval as an example. When we issue an interim approval, that goes out directly to our division contacts for every state. Every state's FHWA division office gets an email, as well as all of our field contacts, which may be more extensive among FHWA personnel. What happens then is that they will work directly with their state DOT to get that information out. What happens there is what happens after that is kind of out of our control. Once it gets to the state DOT, if you're a local, your state DOT may have a different process of getting that information out, or if they choose to adopt that, that can definitely vary. We do always update our website as soon as possible once we've released something as well, so do continue to check that. As well as our partner offices in Federal Highways, Office of Human Environment, the Office of Safety will usually issue an update through their various publications and their partners, such as PUIC, to get the information out if it's within that relevant area of practice. So, for example, an IA that affects the pedestrian and bicycle facility will usually try and get it out through PBIC or APBP or other similar organizations. We'll also try to work with ITE where possible to publicize it. So that's the process, and that's how it's usually intended to work anyway. And I know that our customer at Federal Highways is the state DOTs. We work directly with the state DOTs for not only our little corner of the practice here as well, but funding and support, as well as just other institutional work. So really, our direct work is with the states, and then we rely on the states to trickle that information out to the locals as well. But we do try to put it out through the channels that we have available through our partner offices as well.
Excellent, thank you. This may bring us to the end here, but a really good question about the experiments that are going on, or that as they proceed, as an experiment proceeds, if the evaluation is beginning to find that the performance goals of the treatment were not met, is it possible at that point to make modifications to the experimentation or to the plan and maybe go in a different direction with the treatment? Or is this an indication that a new experiment request needs to be submitted? How much flexibility is there along the way to kind of be reflexive and maybe change the course as you go when looking at a new treatment?
That's a great question, and I'll use a relevant example from the presentation. So when we've accepted experimentation for conflicting motor vehicle movements with bicycle signal indications, one of the things we've asked is that those conflicts that are introduced be very, very strictly monitored. And one of the things you'll find if you're near one of these installations, that most of them don't have any signing informing users of that conflict. We've asked them to put in the flashing yellow arrow, but they don't necessarily have signing trying to explain what that is. But if you look at the experiment request, and if somebody, if you look at how we've written those requests, what we've asked is that with the initial installation, we ask them to take a very detailed look at those interactions at the intersection, and if they think that there is an issue with those conflicts, to immediately step in and work with us to come up with some additional traffic control devices like signs that can be installed to help explain that conflict. So yeah, absolutely, there's definitely room. If ever there's suggested there's a safety issue, that's not only cause to immediately step in and change the experimental plan, but it could be cause to potentially cancel the experiment altogether and revert back to the original design. So there's absolutely room to change any of these plans once they're implemented, depending on the effects that we see. They may not be what we had intended from the initial installation, and we always reserve the right, based on safety concerns, to alter or terminate the experiment should we need to. Now, our preferred outcome is always to change and try to take a different tack, assuming it's safe to do so. But yeah, there's definitely degrees of flexibility built into that once it's installed in the first place, so we can make sure that we're getting the optimum outcome for both us and for the jurisdiction.
Great. Oh, that's perfect. I think that's a great answer, and it brings us, unfortunately, to just the end of our discussion period. I really enjoyed talking through all this with you all, and I hope that we're going to be able to continue some of this with respect to signals in our next webinar. I hope that if you didn't get your question answered, that you'll reach out to us if we can help you find the right information. If Dave or Bill or I can be of service to you, please let us know. We can keep this conversation going offline. For now, though, we're out of time for today. We are going to be sending you a follow-up email in just about an hour that'll have a link to our archive page, instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance, a link to register for our next webinar, and a few other things. So be on the lookout for that. I want to let you know that a very brief survey is going to appear when our webinar is ended today. We would really appreciate your feedback and comments on today's performance and our presentations today. I just want to say to close out, thanks again to both Bill DeSantis and Dave Kirshner, the Federal Highway Administration Office of Safety, for helping put this webinar on. And I want to thank all of you for sitting in on our webinar today. We hope to see you next time, and I hope you all have a great day.